This is a review of George Lucas, The Creative Impulse, Lucasfilm's first 25 years. Because I don't want to bury the lead and waste your time, I'll tell you straight up, this book's a dismal failure. So if you're only interested in getting one book on George Lucas, then just skip this video and wait for the next review, which will be on the cinema of George Lucas, a book that supersedes this one in every way. There's no contest, that's the book you should be getting. If, however, you're a bigger fan and wondering if it's worth picking up this book in addition to that book, then you may want to stick around, as that's kind of the approach we'll take for the rest of the review. The copy we're looking at here is the 1997 revised and updated edition. We'll go over the major differences between this and the original 1992 edition towards the end. The book is primarily a behind-the-scenes look at the movies George Lucas has directed and produced, as well as a little bit about Lucasfilm and its subsidiaries, sort of. Aside from a little bit about his childhood, it's not anything to do with his personal life outside of how it may inform his work and sensibilities as a filmmaker. But basically, you don't want to come to this book hoping for a lot of information on anything, because it's primarily a photo album, and a bad one at that. This book is rendered a complete waste as a result of too many ridiculously gigantic photos taking up most of the space that should have been used for either more photos or, ideally, more text. By the way, of course I'm not saying it's bad for a book to focus on images instead of text. What's bad is how the images are being used to create a detrimental lack of content for no reason whatsoever. Covering one movie production in a book is hard enough, so even the best books struggle when it comes to having to deal with multiple films, let alone George Lucas's history, career, and all the business ventures on top of that. But the people making this book haven't even tried. It's just despicable, lazy nonsense. The book is starved for text and not fulfilling in any sense. For example, A New Hope, one of the 5 movies George Lucas has actually directed, yet there's not a single thing about the shooting of the movie. It jumps from pre-production to post-production, and not even maybe more than a sentence on visual effects, creatures, props, costumes, makeup, set design, and this is one of the movies that is comparatively given the most attention. Nothing is given the room to breathe and be explored, despite the book physically having the space for at least passable coverage. There is no reason everything should be this brief and poorly handled, except that the lazy scumbags who made it wanted to do the quickest, cheapest job possible and pad the whole thing out with gigantic images so they can charge you full price for half a book. As ever though, more than the money, it's the willful negligence, exploitation, and wasted opportunity that infuriates me. We'll go into that a little more later, but I just want to jump ahead in order to take a look at the section on the Temple of Doom, because it's a perfect example of illustrating and summarizing why this book is so bad. So this column of text here, that's all the text there is on the movie. Meanwhile, we have this humongous photo taking up more than an entire page. Not only that, but it's also a still from the movie, which this book has way too many of. I'd say about half the images, which is pointless and deplorable. As you can see, the only other 2 photos are also stills. Then the next page is 2 really nice behind-the-scenes photos, but look at how much room that one's taking up. And it's not like this is an occasional thing to show off a nice photo, it's a style of sizing and layout used throughout the whole book. And look, 1 image per page, done at the expense of being able to include any other much needed content. Next page is another giant still that illustrates another problem, which is it frequently reproduces color photos in black and white. In fact, half of the images in the book are in black and white. Again, 3 images for 2 pages without any other content except the captions, and then the last pages for the movie, 1 behind-the-scenes photo and 3 stills, which again are not only pointless to look at, but taking up an absurd amount of room, rather than just making them all quarter-page size like the bottom 2 and opening up that space for more text, because that thin column of text we saw at the start is utterly ineffectual. So yeah, the Temple of Doom section perfectly encapsulates why this book is an absolute joke. But what makes it even more frustrating is that, quantity aside, the text is actually pretty good, for the most part anyway. It's just a short making of profile for each movie that's just like a scattering of facts and anecdotes, but it's mostly a fairly pure stream of really insightful and or specific information. I learned a bunch of stuff I haven't read elsewhere. Particularly good are the quotes, really well chosen and really effective, to the point that I don't want to dismiss this book out of hand for anyone who's a real mega fan. It's just so disappointing that you have to get the whole crappy package just for the small percent you will enjoy. But for anyone other than the biggest fans, besides, as great as the info frequently is, it's in such a piddly quantity that it feels largely meaningless. You can't get invested when everything is going by like it's in hyperspace. It's just a tease for what could have been rendered pointless in the face of this disastrous use of images that completely sabotages the entire book. There is no defensible reason for it to be this way. It's just another example of a needlessly pointing waste as a result of being produced by incompetent dickheads who couldn't care less, plain and simple. The only other issue in terms of the author's writing is how it occasionally fawns over George Lucas and his cohorts in the movies. There's not so much of it that it's a big deal, but I do always find it unsavory to have an author explicitly telling me how amazing something is or what a genius someone is, rather than just objectively presenting the facts and letting that act as evidence of their genius. Though most of the space is dedicated to George Lucas's bigger productions, it also features on the smaller stuff he's been involved with, even those things where he's more of a silent, often uncredited producer, and these were probably my most and least favorite parts of the text on the movies. Most favorite because there are already so many sources out there that discuss the bigger productions that I find it far more interesting to have a chance to learn about his involvement with other projects, and that's where I found a lot of the new and rewarding insights came from. But the reason it's also my least favorite is because these are the shortest entries that are often nothing more than telling you about the story, or don't reveal anything about George's involvement beyond he produced it or he came up with the story. Again, some really great quotes, especially from George, but not for all the movies featured. And I think that's such a shame because, like I just said, Star Wars and Indian stuff already have an abundance of dedicated making-of sources, whereas for a lot of these smaller productions, they're never going to get their own individual books. So a book like this is really the only opportunity they have to present a deeper look at George's involvement. And yet they're the ones that suffer the most from the book's skimpy text, despite arguably being the most deserving of more attention. In fact, as evidence of that, there's actually a quote in the book from George where he laments that the work he's done on smaller productions is always ignored in favor of the bigger ones, yet he feels the smaller ones are often more reflective of his sensibilities. What's funny though is that this quote appears in the profile for one of these smaller movies that only gets a quarter page, the irony and disservice apparently being lost on the author. Though it's not only the smaller productions that are sometimes neglected in this book, even something like Labyrinth only gets a quarter page of text with not a single sentence of actual information. Also, the Star Wars Holiday Special isn't even mentioned, but we'll discuss that in the Cinema of George Lucas video. But even more than the movies, it's this book's treatment of the companies and facilities George created that is the biggest letdown. For a book on George Lucas, and according to the subtitle, Lucasfilm, I was expecting this to be a much bigger part of the book, especially as I think that stuff is far more important to George Lucas's career than his movies, in terms of what makes him unique as a filmmaker. His role as one of the most impactful individuals on the film industry of all time. I think George Lucas, the entrepreneur and industry leader responsible for all of these companies, innovations, and technologies, is far more important and interesting than George Lucas, the director. And again, that's mostly because the movies get enough focus and already have their own books and stuff, whereas this book represents really the only opportunity to take a look at the history, development, and operating of the companies that allow these movies to happen, yet are never really explored with any depth. And this book just completely squanders the opportunity to focus on the most unique and interesting aspect of its subject and what would be a more valuable contribution to the available literature as a whole. Instead, this is the worst part of the text in the book, presenting nothing more than a corporate puff piece on how amazing and successful Lucasfilm and its subsidiaries, products and services are, all crammed into 7 pages, or 15 if you count those that only include images. However, an additional 10 pages are dedicated solely to Skywalker Ranch, making it the lengthiest exploration of a single area covered in the book, and consequently my favorite part. Despite it completely looking and reading like a brochure for a country house hotel, it's the most information on Skywalker Ranch, its development, facilities, and culture that I've ever come across in one place. And it's the only thing something that gets better coverage in this book than it does in the cinema of George Lucas. As I said, I think that sort of stuff is the most important and fascinating part of examining and understanding George Lucas as a filmmaker and a mogul who was able to reject Hollywood convention and found an empire to pursue his own vision of how things should be. Regardless of what certain people may think of him personally or some of his creative decisions, the impact and autonomy he achieved via these companies is remarkable, and yet almost entirely neglected in a book on him. In terms of some other more specific books you may want to look into for deeper coverage on the various companies, there's a book called Rogue Leaders, The Story of LucasArts, which I've not read, but it's out there if you're interested in the video game side of things. I've also done reviews on all 3 Industrial Light and Magic books, though the big problem I had across the board with those was the distinct lack of information on the company, facilities, history, and development, and so on. Other than that, you can only hope to piece together information found in other Star Wars books and George Lucas biographies, which again is why I feel this book should have prioritized that stuff, yet in here there's nothing to do with the creation of ILM, for example. It just magically appears fully operational, which is pretty slack for a book that's supposed to be covering the story of someone's career and, according to the book's subtitle, Lucasfilm itself. So the original edition of this book was published in 1992, with this revised and updated edition being released in 97. Waiting just 5 years before releasing an updated edition of a book is a shameless swindle, but it gets so much worse. So the expanded content is a largely worthless 24 extra pages of garbage. We have coverage on the Star Wars special editions, there's 8 pages on the movie compilation versions of the Young Indiana Jones episodes, and that just recounts the plot in 1, maybe 2 sentences of behind-the-scenes information for each of them. Then 5 pages of ads for LucasArts best-selling games, no behind-the-scenes insight whatsoever, just blatant advertising, plain and simple. But still it gets worse. The thing that really brings my piss to a boil is that it does that thing where updated editions don't just add stuff, they also remove and change content. Images were replaced for no reason, some that were in color are now in black and white, and it removes a bunch of really good images that were in the original too. It does all this, yet doesn't do anything to fix the ridiculous image sizing and layout issues which would have allowed them more space to include all the previously published images and the new ones. It's disgraceful and insultingly inconsiderate because even if you are a huge fan coerced into their scam to get you to double dip in order to get the new content, but even then you're kind of forced to keep your old copy rather than replace it because both contain content not in the other. So no matter which edition you get, or even if you get both, it's a no-win slap in the face courtesy of the scum and villainy that infests and dominates the publishing industry. So ultimately, this book is a complete failure that has no reason to exist in this form. But despite that, as a massive fan, is there any reason you would want to add it to your collection? It depends. If you're the obsessive completist, then yeah, I guess so. But for everyone below that, it's hard to say. For 99.9% of potential readers, the answer is no way. Especially if you're only interested in a couple of the movies or just the companies and business stuff, there's nowhere near enough. You have to be interested in all that stuff, all the movies and George Lucas and filmmaking in general, for there even to be something approaching a mass that would just barely make it worth bending over to pick up. And that's the category I fall into. I did genuinely enjoy those parts of the text that were good. Your mileage may vary, but there was enough detail and insight in here that I have not come across elsewhere. So, even if only in the most begrudging way possible, I was glad to learn about it. But when I say that, I'm really talking about occasional individual facts and sentences. The vast majority is just stuff that's repeated and covered far better in other sources, which is why, for everyone but the most obsessive fans, I unequivocally recommend completely ignoring this disgraceful book in favor of the far superior cinema of George Lucas, which essentially covers everything this book does, plus much more.